Hello. After a good break, we will continue with our Saturday agenda with the conference Human Trafficking Research in Canada, in charge of Adam Cotter. Let me check if Adam is the call. Adam, are you here?
Hi, did that work?
Yeah, that's work.
Okay, so yeah, hi, I'm Adam Cotter. I'm happy to be here today.
So I'll introduce our speaker for today's session. Adam is a senior analyst with the Canadian Centre for Justice and Community Safety Statistics at Statistics Canada, where he was worked since 2010. Alan has a master's degree in criminology from the University of Ottawa. His recent publications include a report on trafficking in persons in Canada, intimate partner violence in Canada, sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces, and perception of personal safety during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the floor is yours, Adam, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks again for the invitation. I'm happy to be here today on behalf of the Canadian Centre for Justice and Community Safety Statistics division at Statistics Canada. I know this conference has been in the works, or this event, for quite some time, so I'm happy to see that it's come to life, and I'm excited to see what kind of the results are of this of the event. Let me see if I'm able to. I do have slides, but it seems I'm unable to share them, so I can walk through them and then send them after the fact to everyone, if that would work.
Let me check if Sophia or Haley to help us with that.
Hey, Adam, do you see at the bottom of your screen, there should be a mute button, a start video button, and a share button? Do you see that one?
Yes, but it's telling me the browser doesn't support sharing.
Oh, that's on. Okay.
It's maybe that because we're projecting now on a slide, or
if you wanted to share the slides, you could also email them to Sophia or I. We could share our screen, but whatever is easiest for you.
Okay. I just sent them yesterday to Fernando, so let me send them quick, and then
Perfect.
the visual will probably be better, I think.
Okay, sounds good. I'll send me and Sophia's emails in the chat.
Sorry about this.
No worries at all.
Okay, so I've just sent, and in the meantime, I can get started with the beginning of what I'd like to talk about, which doesn't really require the visual. So what I'll be presenting today is just an overall highlight of the kind of information we rely on at Statistics Canada when we're monitoring the prevalence and nature of human trafficking in Canada. So a little bit about how we collect the information, where it comes from, what information is collected, and just as important, what information isn't collected by our sources, and a little bit about what these sources are. Very quickly, just what the data that we have is telling us about the nature and prevalence of human trafficking in Canada right now, and then moving on to kind of a focus on the data gaps. So what we don't know that would be really critical for us to understand in order to develop good, solid prevention programs, countering human trafficking, and a couple of ways that we're trying to fill those gaps, and a few examples of some of the complementary data sets that we've started to work with to supplement what we already have at Statistics Canada. So for human trafficking at Statistics Canada, our key data source is police reported data. So it's data that's sent to us from police services across the country. Our typical source is the Uniform Crime Reporting Survey. So it's a mandatory survey for police services in Canada to reply to. More than 1,200 police services across the country provide information from their administrative records on a monthly basis. We obtain the data from each individual police service, so we're able to look at it at the national level, the provincial level, the city level, all the way down to the specific police service level. So we can do quite a bit of analysis looking at different spots in the country, areas of interest, comparing urban areas to rural areas, for example. In addition to that, we get this data on an annual basis, and so we're able to monitor changes, track things over time and between regions, which is also really important when we're talking about developing prevention programs. The way the data comes to us is in 3 separate files that get extracted from the police service records management. So there's an incident file, so that includes information about the incident. So what type of crime it is, for example, human trafficking, the date it's reported to police, whether or not it's resulted in charges being laid or recommended by police, where the incident happened. That's not only the police service, the province, the city, but also, for example, in a private residence versus a commercial building versus on the street. The weapon present, if there are any weapons involved in the incident. We also receive a victim file, so that includes information about any victims related to that incident, including their age, their gender, their level of injury, if they were injured, was the injury caused by a weapon, as well as what the relationship is to the accused person. And the third record that we get is the accused person record. We call it the charged or suspect chargeable file. And we get similar information on that, so age, gender. We also get whether or not they were charged, if so, when and what were they charged with. And so these files come to us separately, so you can use them as individual files, but often we combine them because you get a much more thorough, robust analysis and a lot more contextual information about crime by combining all of them. These files don't include personal identifiers, but they do include kind of algorithms that have been stripped and anonymized from the police services records management before they get to Statistics Canada. Using those, we can do sort of record linkage projects. So we can look at how many times a particular individual is showing up either in our victim file or in our accused file. We can follow incidents from the police to the court and look at patterns in different offense types in charging and really analyze the nature of crime like that. Those are some of the things I mentioned that we do get, but you probably noticed there's a whole lot of information that would be really relevant to understanding crime, in particular human trafficking, that we don't get from police on these data files. So for example, individual characteristics such as language, ethnicity, sexual orientation, indigenous identity, all sorts of things that we know that are risk factors for human trafficking and for all other types of crime, but isn't known to us through the information we get from police. And specific to human trafficking, things that would be really important to understand if we're trying to prevent it, but we don't know from our police data is, for example, the type of exploitation. Is this trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation, or is it labor trafficking and labor exploitation? What is the country of origin of the victim if it's international trafficking? Even what is the city or the province of the victim if it's domestic traveling? Any details about how the victims became involved in trafficking is lacking from these administrative records that we get from police. So while they do tell us a lot, they still do leave a lot of gaps in our knowledge about human trafficking. So we receive information on human trafficking. It's defined in the Criminal Code of Canada under various sections and subsections. There are 7 specific offenses that comprise human trafficking in the criminal code. So trafficking in persons under the age of 18 years, trafficking to receive a material benefit, and then same offense but under 18, and then withholding or destroying documents for the purposes of trafficking a person or trafficking a person under 18 years. All of these forms are combined together under one code in the information we get from police. So another limitation is that there's no way to know from the incident data itself which of these 7 specific offenses is involved when we receive information about an incident. There is also another violation type that we include when we're looking at human trafficking. It's not a criminal code offense, but it's an offense under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. Oh, I see the slides. So I'm just on slide 6. And these ones have been fairly just text-based, so not missing too much of the visual. Okay, if you could go one more slide, please. Thank you. So this is the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act offense that we get. Under this violation, we capture information about incidents that involve bringing persons into Canada for the purposes of human trafficking. So when we talk about international versus domestic human trafficking, the criminal code offenses that we get information on, they could be international, they could be domestic. There's nothing in the information from police that tells us which one or the other is the case. But for the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, we know that these offenses involve either the crossing or the potential crossing of the border into or outside of Canada. And these account for about 1/3 of all of the incidents that come to the attention of police. The limitation of these incidents, though, so it gives us that important picture, but because it's not a criminal code incident, the record management systems aren't set up to capture information on victims or accused persons and then subsequently send it on to us when we receive the data. So for this kind of offense, we only know how many incidents police have identified. We don't know how many victims of these incidents are. We don't know anything about the accused persons in terms of their characteristics or the number of people who are involved in this specific type of trafficking. Moving to the next slide, please. So in addition to the police data that I've talked about, we also have data on human trafficking through our integrated criminal court survey. So that's data that captures court appearances related to a specific charge or case. And from this data set, we can determine how many human trafficking cases are before the court, how long it takes to process them, whether or not they result in a finding of guilt, and if they result in a finding of guilt, what are the types of sentences that are imposed on the people who are convicted of these offenses. But the reality of this source for tracking outcomes of human trafficking cases is that we need to consider that between a charge being laid by a police officer and then appearing in court, a lot of things can happen. The charges can be dropped for a variety of reasons, insufficient evidence, choosing not to participate, a plea bargain. Cases can transform between police identifying it as human trafficking and it being seen or heard in criminal court. So maybe the Crown prosecutors determine that there's not enough evidence to pursue human trafficking, but there is enough evidence to pursue sexual assault or another exploitation case, for example. Only looking at the court's data, we'd never be able to flag that as human trafficking. One of the things we can do that we've done recently is linking these incidents using the key identifiers on the file to look at what happens to the cases that police identify as human trafficking. So what we found was that by the time a human trafficking incident appears in court, or a human trafficking incident as indicated by police appears in court, about half of them don't involve a charge of human trafficking at all. And the ones that do still involve human trafficking are less likely to result in a finding of guilt when they're heard before the criminal courts. On the next slide, I'll just quickly go through a little bit of the data to give you a picture of So I've mentioned a few of the limitations, some of the data. I'll continue to do that as we go through these, but just to kind of give you an idea of what the data we have does tell us about human trafficking in Canada right now. So from this chart, it shows that the number and rate of human trafficking has generally been going up. In 2019, it went up 44% compared to the previous year, and it was the highest number ever reported by police in Canada. On the whole, over the past decade, there have been just under 2,500 incidents reported by police in Canada. As I mentioned, two-thirds of these are criminal code violations, and 1/3 are the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act incidents. So that means that at least 1/3 of human trafficking in Canada involves the crossing of the border into or out of Canada. Another thing to note in terms of, so this data shows a pretty clear increase over time. Low numbers at the beginning of the decade, steadily increasing, represents a small proportion of crime, but it is growing. But it's important to note that when we're looking at this data, increases reported in recent years, they could reflect an increase in human trafficking. That's certainly part of it, but other factors might contribute to the increase we're seeing in the data. So for example, there's more of an effort to combat this crime. It's receiving more attention, so police are more aware of it. There's improved law enforcement capacities. There's greater victim protection efforts. There are hotlines and federal, provincial, municipal government initiatives that have been implemented to try to address it, including increasing supports and services for victims and survivors. Continued efforts that might contribute to more willingness from victims to report, more awareness among police and members of public to report or detect or suspect these types of crime. So all these factors kind of help to contextualize the increase that we've seen in the data, as well as why the numbers were relatively so small earlier in the decade. So it's not necessarily a direct and true reflection of the actual incidence of human trafficking. There are other factors that influence how police data is recorded and reported. On the next slide, please. Thank you. So since 2009, over the past decade, or more than a decade now, the vast majority of victims in these incidents have been women and girls. So for example, in 2019 alone, 95% of victims were women and girls. And generally speaking, these victims of this crime are young. Over 2/3 are under the age of 25, and about a quarter were under 18. And this is one place where the data lines up with what's been found in qualitative research that has highlighted that young women are targeted and young women are most vulnerable to this type of crime. And on the other hand, the data on the accused persons shows us that most accused people are men. Similar to victims, it tends to be younger men, with 2/3 of all accused people were men between the ages of 18 and 34. Most of the time, the accused persons and the victims are not strangers, according to our data. So most victims know the person who's trafficking them, most commonly as a friend, acquaintance, or as a boyfriend or girlfriend or other intimate partner. Only 11% of incidents since 2009 have involved strangers as the accused person. And again, looking at what we know from qualitative research, this makes sense when you take into account like grooming techniques that suggest how traffickers take time to get to know, put themselves in a position of trust a lot of the time with the people who eventually are trafficked. So this information, again, this tells us some key information. It tells us who's most at risk. It tells us who's most likely to be involved as the accused person. But it also highlights a lot of the gaps that remain when we're looking at the data we have. So for example, in this chart, when we've combined age and gender, unfortunately, it's pretty well exhausted the demographic information that we get from police services on our victim and accused files. So it highlights a lot of the gaps that remain because there's so many characteristics that would be really important from a prevention or risk perspective, that aren't captured in the records, so we aren't able to have a complete picture of them when we're doing our analysis. So things like sexual orientation, indigenous identity, ethnicity, language, disability status, income, family status, or history. So for some of these characteristics, we can begin to exploit record linkage for for other sources, but often it's not practical for police to provide this information, because even if it would be relevant for some types of crime like human trafficking, it could be based on the officer's assumptions. On the next slide, please. So I just saw a chat pop up about the labor trade and what our data are saying about that. And that's a really great question. So what our data shows us is that most commonly, the incidents that come to the attention of police are associated to the sex trade. So not only the victim profile tells us that, but also police can report more than one violation in an incident. And a large proportion of the incidents that involve other violations related to the sex trade or other sexual offenses. So often we do have that additional level of context. But it's important to note that nothing in the criminal code necessitates, like, whether there's one definition of human trafficking and it's not specified whether it's for the purposes of sexual exploitation or labor exploitation. So this is another data gap that I was going to speak to later in the presentation, but it's important and bring it up now, is that we don't have believe that they would be arrested themselves if they turn to authorities. They may perceive, and this is kind of shown in our data, what we do have, they may perceive that their abuser is a friend or partner instead of somebody who is trafficking them as a result of the grooming and the recruitment process. On the next slide, please. So in addition to those factors, even if victims do report to police or police become aware of it in another way, another